Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
All right, thank you. Thank you. My name is Muñoz Martinez, and I'm an assistant professor here at Brown University in the Department of American Studies, and I'm also a faculty fellow at the John Nicholas Brown Center for Public Humanities. I want to give a huge thank you to Marissa Brown, who's in the back, who's working all the time, for bringing us together. We had a few conversations last year in the spring, and months later, after so much hard work, Marissa built this beautiful conference. So I'm so thankful for her, and to the staff, Sabina, who's here, and the students who are helping and volunteering throughout the day. Thank you for your time. And I want to give a special thanks to Susan Smullian, who's the director of the Public Humanities Center, that provided support for mapping violence when really nobody else on the university would. So she took us in as a project, gave us space, gave us institutional support from the staff, and since then we've really grown and thrived. But the center has continued to be an incubator and a home for us, so I'm forever grateful. I'm also so thankful for the panelists who've traveled to be here and are spending time with us today. This is we're bringing together a group of scholars that are thinking critically about the use of digital tools to recover disavowed or obscured histories of racial violence, and recovering these histories with the idea of thinking about social justice as a primary goal and mission of our projects, both scholarly work and public-facing work. So I should say that the conversation amongst some of the panelists has been extensive and continuing over years. Margaret Burnham, who you will hear from, convened a conference called the Digital Red Record in January 2018. And since then, a conversation has formed where different projects working on racial violence have been able to come together to think about opportunities for collaboration, but also thinking through the problems of what it means for humanities work and social sciences to enter into the digital humanities, and to think about how that should flow naturally and how to embrace the tensions to actually shift conversations in the digital humanities as needed. So I'll introduce the speakers, and then each of the presenters will come up and present, and then we'll convene at the end for Q&A. Jim McGrath is a postdoctoral fellow in the digital public humanities at Brown Center for Public Humanities. At Brown, Jim supports various digital initiatives, including mapping violence. Before coming to Brown, Jim was project co-director of our marathon, the Boston Bombing Digital Archive, an award-winning digital humanities project. His writing has appeared in American Quarterly, Digital Humanities Quarterly, History at Work, and elsewhere, and he's been an invaluable collaborator and contributor, so I'm so glad that he's going to join me to talk about mapping violence today. Margaret Burnham is the University Distinguished Professor of Law at Northeastern University. She is the founder of the School of Law's Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project, the CRRJ, which conducts research and supports policy initiatives on anti-civil rights violence in the United States and other miscarriages of justice during the period between 1930 and 1970. CRRJ serves as a resource for scholars, policymakers, and organizers involved in various initiatives seeking justice for these crimes. In 1993, South African President Nelson Mandela appointed Professor Burnham to serve on an International Human Rights Commission to investigate alleged human rights violations within the African National Congress. This commission was a precursor to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In 2010, Professor Burnham headed a team of outside counsel and law students in a landmark case that settled a federal lawsuit. Professor Burnham's team accused Franklin County, Mississippi law enforcement officers of assisting Klansmen in the kidnapping, torture, and murder of two 19-year-olds, Henry D. and Charles Eddie Moore. The case and settlement were widely covered in the national press, and I've been thinking a lot about that work and our ongoing efforts to seek justice at the hands of violence by police. Melissa Nobles is the Dean of the School of Humanities, Arts, and Social Sciences, and Professor of Political Science, at MIT. Nobles' research and teaching have focused on the comparative study of racial and ethnic politics and issues of retrospective justice. Her current research centers on constructing a database of racial killings in the American South from 1930 to 1954, As a faculty collaborator and advisory board member for the CRRJ for the legal clinic, and Nobles has contributed to building the archive to advance this work and continue the efforts to recover these histories. She is the author of many books, including Shades of Citizenship, Race and the Census in Modern Politics, and The Politics of Official Apologies. And for those graduate students in the room who I've been pointing you to her work, here she is, joining us today. And they'll also be joined by Katie Sanson, who's a legal fellow at CRRJ, who's going to help with a demonstration. Geoff Ward is the Associate Professor and Associate Chair of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the author of The Black Child Savers, Racial Democracy and Juvenile Justice, and an award-winning book on the rise, fall, and haunting remnants of Jim Crow juvenile justice. His current projects further examine histories of racial violence, their legacies, and implications for repair. These include the Racial Violence Archive, a digital resource for research, teaching, and engagement, and the upcoming exhibition, Truths and Reckonings, The Art of Transformative Racial Justice, which will be opening in spring 2020 at Washington University. He's joined by David Cunningham, a professor and chair of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. His research examines the causes, dynamics, and legacies of racial violence with an emphasis on the historical and contemporary mobilization of white supremacist action. His latest book is called Klansville, USA, The Rise and Fall of Civil Rights Era Ku Klux Klan. He's also an executive board member of Washington University's Prison Education Project. He has received multiple awards for teaching and mentorship, and he's been featured in media speaking to the public about the history of the Ku Klux Klan in our current context, and he was even featured on Fresh Air with Terry Gross, which, you know, gotta brag about. Mariah So joins us from the West Coast. Thank you so much for making the trip. She is a GIS specialist at the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies at UCLA with the $1 Million Hoods Project. Mariah received her master's degree in Geographic Information Systems from the University of Redlands and her bachelor's in Environment, Economics, and Politics from Scripps College. Her research interests include critical cartography, indigenous methodologies, and interdisciplinary storytelling. So we're so glad that she would join us here, and she's representing not only the huge team of $1 Million Efforts, but especially Kelly Lytle Hernandez, who also just we learned 2 days ago won the MacArthur Fellowship, in large part for her histories of racial violence on the U.S.-Mexico border, but also in being the primary investigator for $1 Million Hoods. So congratulations to the team. All right. Okay, that's a superstar panel list of participants. So I'm going to kick off the panel by talking about mapping violence really quickly. So I'll speak for 10 minutes, and then Jim will take over. As I said, I'm a professor in the Department of American Studies and a faculty fellow at the JMBC, but I'm also a co-founder of a nonprofit called Refusing to Forget, which is a project, a collaboration of historians who've come together to try to commemorate a history of racial violence targeting Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals in Texas in the early 20th century. And so over a series of years, we've made some progress in commemorating this history as a period of state-sanctioned racial violence, not just vigilante violence, collaborating with museums in Texas and with the Texas Historical Commission to unveil historical markers. And our work has really been guided by the work of descendants of racial violence who have been calling for a critical acknowledgement of this history of racial violence and for state participation in reckoning with this history. But in some of those conversations with these collaborators, we felt the stress and the strain of what it means to negotiate and work with cultural institutions and state institutions. Namely, with the Texas Historical Commission, I had some frank conversations with the staff at the Texas Historical Commission. We unveiled 4 historical markers over a series of 5 years now. But one of the staff members said very frankly one day during a meeting, we can't have a marker for every lynching in Texas. There were just too many. So that speaks volumes. But thankfully, I was working with a master's student here in the Public Humanities Center, Amelia Grabowski, who's now at the Smithsonian. And she said, she was just as angry as I was when we were reflecting that conversation. And the anger was just sort of, being projected everywhere. She said, well, we can make our own markers. What if we map them? And so that really started this project, Mapping Violence, that now years later has developed into a major research project here at Brown. One of the central premises of my first manuscript, The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, was that when it comes to histories of violence, the official archive is incomplete and corrupt. Fully reckoning with histories of the past requires a fuller and more accurate record. I believe that research also needs to make visible the interconnected histories of racial violence and the various civil rights efforts. This need for a new project, for a new collection of obscured histories, drives my second major research project, Mapping Violence, Racial Terror in Texas, 1900 to 1930. This project seeks to enrich current understandings of histories of racial violence, utilize new digital methods for recovering histories, and offer a model for using new digital tools to present findings to academic and wider publics. If shared widely, I hope, that these histories can shape new fields of historical inquiry, change public understandings of the past, and shape new, more inclusive societies today. Mapping Violence is not a collection of digitized sources about historical events, but instead a digital publication of scholarly research in the form of digital essays, maps, and interactive visualizations. Since 2014, I've been the primary investigator for this digital research project that makes use of digital tools to expose historical patterns of vigilante and police violence that targeted multiple racial and ethnic groups in Texas from 1900 to 1930. The project's recovery effort shifts long-time patterns followed by historians. Mapping Violence aims to expose interconnected histories of violence, the legacies of colonization, slavery, and genocide that intersect in Texas. Although often segregated in academic studies and in popular memory, these histories coalesce geographically, temporally, and in some cases, the same agents of violence moved across the state, targeting different racial and ethnic groups. But for too long, historians have tended to segregate studies of vigilante violence from extralegal violence at the hands of police. And the public has largely understood the history of anti-Black violence as the history of lynchings. And for those few people who know about the history of anti-Mexican violence, they tend to think about anti-Mexican violence as taking place at the hands of police. So I've found that a fuller understanding of racial violence requires studying cases of lynchings, police murder, intimidation, rape, mutilation, and physical assault together. To be sure, cases of African Americans and Mexican Americans that died while in police custody in Texas can reveal more when we study them together than when we keep them segregated. So the goals for Mapping Violence, after that sort of bigger framing, are quite concrete. We want to create a record of interconnected histories of violence in Texas from 1900 to 1930, and the diverse strategies used to seek justice, right? So we're not just looking for a body count, but we're also want to recover these histories of people who fought for social justice 100 years ago. We also want to inspire new research and identify new methods for digital storytelling. So we're thinking not just about the static visualizations, but the way to make these histories accessible to different public audiences. And we want to make these histories publicly available. We want to shift public understandings of the past and inform current debates about immigration and policing and justice as they're being imagined today. But we're taking seriously this goal of making this public to reach multiple audiences. So that means that when we're building this project, we've been designing it with multiple audiences in mind from the start. This isn't a project that's thinking about the scholarly audience and then says, well, how can we make it available to the public? How can we translate it? We're thinking about these audiences right from the beginning and thinking about different audience needs. So for scholars and researchers, they want access to the data, they want access to the historical sources and the events. Educators, both K through 12 and university faculty, want access to lesson plans, primary sources, and supplemental teaching resources. We're also thinking about everyday users, what it means to put this research up into a digital platform and for everyday people to stumble upon it because they clicked on a link in a media report. And so we're thinking about the kinds of curated content that we need to develop historical essays, biographies, and digital tours so that people who don't have a foundation in this history can actually come to it, learn some of the historical insights, and make something meaningful of that interaction. And we're also thinking about the descendants of violence, people who have been working for generations to try to have these histories commemorated. So in some cases, that means direct collaboration with descendants to help not just with public projects on the ground in Texas, but also to think about what documentation means for them, creating a place where their private collections can be preserved, where we can think about the kinds of evidence that they have access to, family photographs, family records that, of course, weren't preserved by the Library of Congress or Texas collectors, museums, and archives. And this group in particular also helps us to think about the overall tone of the project. That when we are mapping these histories, when we are visualizing these histories, that these are not just, bland data points. These are histories of loss and histories of injustice. And so thinking about this group in particular is really also framing the design of the project. So to some of the work that we've been taking on in the first part of this project, the first years, is to build and create this record. And so we are thinking again of racially motivated acts of violence that targeted multiple racial and ethnic groups from 1900 to 1930. And so we are hoping to recover cases of violence that targeted African Americans, ethnic Mexicans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, and European immigrant minorities to have a more comprehensive view of how racial violence functioned in this early 20th century. And we are tracking and documenting and researching multiple forms of violence, as I said earlier, moving beyond just mob violence, but to think about police violence, and also the acts of violence that created terror and fear and shaped societies, but didn't lead to death. And so in some cases, this is intimidation, torture, rape, physical assault, and mutilation. And we are also recording the various strategies for seeking justice. And we think about this especially when we're thinking about teaching tools and those popular audiences. What does it mean to create an archive that only focuses on the loss of life or violence? And how is it radically changed if you give people access to those efforts for social justice, court cases that were filed by widows, armed resistance, journalists who created a record, legislation, efforts to pass legislation, international investigations, and the role of foreign consuls in creating avenues for redress for some. We've been in the past year in this tricky process of translating this historical research into metadata, into thinking about what does it mean to actually take that deep archival work and then translate it into a digital form that can then be used as data, that can then be searched and sliced for different visualizations. And so as students are researching different cases, we are pulling out and recording information about the victims, about the aggressors, and about the types of violence. And so you can already quickly imagine how you would map cases of lynchings or episodes of racial violence that highlight the biographical information of the victims, or that same map that highlights the biographical information of the aggressors. Was there a judge involved? Was it a police officer involved? Or a prominent landowner, for example? And that we are also collecting information about case outcomes. So we can also think about the other kinds of maps that we can create, whether these events led to any sorts of investigations or indictments or prosecutions. Was there media coverage? Were there civil suits? And then, of course, the anti-violence advocacy is something that has really come from the student researchers on the team who keep finding examples and saying, this is really important to include. One of them is here. Maggie Goddard, wave your hand, Maggie. All right, really quickly, I did want to say that the project holds on to this idea, lives not metadata, and we hold that concretely in the decisions that we're making about how we're collecting, but also how we're approaching using digital tools for our work. And so that means that we are using this and thinking about how to build digital tools that can also hold the ambiguities of historical research and the gaps and the silences in historical archives. So we worked with student researchers and student developers, from undergraduates to graduate students. Kaylin Hansen and Edward Zhao were two undergraduate students that were sophomore computer science students that helped to build this database entry form. This is the first iteration that helped us to do things like include all of the research in one place, but also start to track the student labor and all of the students that had contributed to researching these cases. They also built in categories for entry that could hold those ambiguities of historical research. So for some of the events, for example, if we are pulling on an oral history that says, an event took place in early October 1915, if there was a static form that asked for a strict date, students wouldn't have been able to enter those dates. They would get stuck at that point. And so Kaylin Hansen designed this entry form to allow for that kind of flexibility in data entry. This is a view of our data entry database 2.0, and you can see some of the prompts that students receive that we're also in the phase where we're making decisions about how to assign GPS locations to some of these events. And so in some cases, we know the exact place where somebody died or where somebody was beat. In many of the cases, we just know a county or a town or that it took place on a ranch. And so we're still making decisions, and so students enter based on their research. They suggest a location in GPS coordinates, and then they include location rationales, so that as a research team, we can return to these later and decide, is the county courthouse the best place? Is the last known residence of the victim the best place? And so some of these decisions were in the process this year of making choices about how to come up with a guide for having a consistent approach to making these decisions about location. And I will also say that in terms of thinking about the metadata and thinking about the lives and the events that are represented in these events, students are also using public humanities skills. They're using their skills in museum curation, for example, to develop longer narratives that give people access to what took place at each dot that might be represented on a map. And so you can see sort of, this is for the back end for the research team, but you can see how we're starting to collect the metadata about different victims and aggressors, but also that students are doing the intellectual work of writing these narratives, that as a team, we draft them together and we work through them together. We think about tone, we think about what kinds of details to include, and here we're also thinking really critically about the sources that we draw on so that we're not replicating the archival grammar of some of the sources, especially these sources that celebrate these acts of violence, that you could say today is actually hate rhetoric and not sources of truth. And so those words there, I just wanted to flag the work that's going into creating these narratives. So just for time, I want to also say that this is building on early mapping efforts and early efforts by people like Ida B. Wells, who built the Red Record in the early 20th century, late 19th and early 20th century. We're thinking using maps like this as inspiration, as a reminder that we don't need to be fancy, we need to be effective, but that also that this early heat map is so helpful in conveying information quickly, and that what we want to draw inspiration from this is to figure out how to get people access to what those dark colors mean, what those slashes mean, so that people can look at a map visually, quickly learn some information, but then also draw them in to engage with these histories and to think about them critically. And so that's something that I wanted to draw our attention to, some of the sort of early models that we're looking at. And so this is an example of a sort of student prototype to imagine how somebody might click on a dot and then get access to more information about the events rather than just looking at a static dot. I wanted to close and pass this over to Jim. Jim, who is a gem, by showing the work that we're also trying to do to document collaborations over time. And so these are student collaborators, graduate students, and we're also thinking about how it is to document those kinds of contributions, because this project, this kind of recovery project, takes years. Building the digital tools to support the project takes years. And then, of course, testing. This is going to be an ongoing effort. And so there are a number of students who've contributed to this, and this kind of collaboration has been vital to the progress that we've made. So thank you to the students who are here. All right, Jim. You want to move there?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Let's get your beverages.
Yeah, all my beverages.
Can I take this water?
Yeah, that's not mine.
Okay, cool. Hi. I have a water now. I should put this down so I stop holding it. So yeah, I'm Jim McGrath. I wanted to round out the talk by highlighting some recent work by the project team and some reflections on the iterative and pedagogical dimensions of this collaborative project work. And I've been working on the project I think since before I started. I think in 2015, but yeah, anyway. As I was putting the slides together, though, I was looking at this older, 2 years old, description of some of the key project questions, which I think gets some of what Monica's talked a bit about before, more explicit on the table, and it's changed a little bit over time in terms of the emphases. So we've tried to ground this project's interest in digital contexts, so we don't lose sight of our interests in addressing historical erasures, revealing state complicity, and resonating with specific audiences. I mean, I think that given the amount of time we've spent on this project, we could have spun out a version 1.0 of Mapping Violence that looks like a digital humanities project, put out by an academic group. But we've taken the time to think and talk about what happens when these stories and these experiences get remediated as data points and visualizations, what digital tools will address our storytelling and audience interests rather than our desire to make or publish something, and we see that in some of the digital humanities context that I come from, and also how this project is complementing storytelling, outreach, activism, that's a video game company, activism, and education in other non-digital contexts. So rather than putting all of our eggs in one basket, as Shannon talked about in the keynote, just like that one map is not going to fix all these things. And Monica's been involved, and other collaborators have been really involved on the ground in Texas and in other contexts to talk about the issues informing this project. And we also are interested in how the forms of collaboration that we're taking up across institutional spaces on and off campus with undergraduates and graduate students with clear investments in digital public humanities rather than just digital humanities, are also raising questions about how universities, departments, and libraries support or don't support these kinds of initiatives. So thinking, reflecting on what's working, what's not working, what's difficult to pull off, and what's not has been a part of all this too. So some of the priorities that we're rolling into for the next year. So we're collaborating with the Brown University Library Center for Digital Scholarship. So the summer's been spent doing the work of data migration onto university service that the library has control over. And obviously this is an eye towards long-term preservation, as well as the database and visualization expertise that folks like Bruce Bauchek, how do you say your last name again? Bocek, thank you. Bocek and Patrick Rashley at CDS provide for us. We're doing lots of project documentation work. As we saw from this previous slide, we've had a lot of people coming in and out, and despite our best intentions, you want to be keeping track of what's been happening and what research has been done and what questions have come up. The metadata schema is iterative too, and Monica's talked a bit about this, how we've made certain decisions or thought about what's getting represented as data points in datas and what those sort of outputs are. We're continuing to refine the work of taking the historical research and then thinking about data creation and data cleanup. And we're also thinking really explicitly about public-facing data visualizations for the next year. We want to get a few things up and rolling, and just to go back to these audiences that we are interested in visualizations that will ideally resonate with some or all of these audiences or things that we're prioritizing. So in digital humanities work, there's been a real turn towards sort of slow digital humanities. The fact that this work does take time, involves lots of money, involves lots of labor, lots of emails and doodle polls and sort of various other things. But working in digital public humanities, I think there's also, sometimes that slow DH kind of forgets about the audiences and the fact that, if a visualization tool is ephemeral, that still means you can do something potentially with it for a couple of years and have a sort of project lifespan and a sunsetting approach to it. We on the project have been really thinking about the data itself and preserving that data and make sure that, but we're really moving towards these data endpoints that are engaging with different audiences and really trying to shift the emphasis there. We're also looking at models for how other digital projects are visualizing acts of racial violence. So I just have a few up here, and these are I just said the word models, but these are things that we're trying to be in conversation with, or sort of looking at for how other groups have been working with data and thinking about visualization of data. So the Lynching in America project, which has a lot of support from Google, is sort of trying to use these visualizations to sort of insist on the presence of these lynchings and tell stories that sort of emphasize the scope spatially in certain ways. This project, which is out of data journalism in collaboration with academic context, looks at a week of violence in Brazil and then does a sort of visualization of the various points where that happened and is complemented by journalistic narratives. I think there's a lot of interesting work happening in data journalism context, and sometimes academics are in conversation with them, sometimes they're not. So that's a good place to look and to critique as well. The Atlantic slave trade in 2 minutes. Some folks might have seen this project, right? So there's this visualization that is thinking temporally, and it's presenting this sort of short thing, but it's also getting at, I think, some of what Monica's talked about thinking about the bodies behind the data and the various other experiences. So it can have its it has certain effects on audiences, but then it also obscures certain aspects of the history as well. And then the Torn Apart Separados project, I think, which some folks might know, there are a lot of collaborators which are documented on their website, but one of the things that they're trying to do is sort of thinking about visualizing showing that, as Alex Giel, who works on this project, talks about, how the border is everywhere, right? In that when we think about visualizations and representations of the work of ICE that just focus on the border itself, we're missing these other aspects of this humanitarian crisis and acts of terrorism that are happening in the country. If we're not looking at, we can look at it in different ways using visualizations. I wanted to just bring in, just because Monica and I have both written about this, and I'll share those links. We've written about the project, so I wanted to just share some sort of points of inspiration for the projects and then get out of the way, because we have lots of other folks talking today. So when this work on the project, it does remind me a lot of the work of the Grimke sisters and Theodore Weld, that in that it's looking at materials that are labeling and representing and describing victims of racial violence, and then it's trying to look at that information and then redeploy it, right, and sort of build a data set that could potentially lead to new narratives, whether they're visualizations or more traditional text-based writing and things like that. So this is a good article on the Grimke sisters and Weld's work. I think a lot in terms of collaboration about the work that Moya Bailey does in terms of thinking about how this collaborative work is iterative. It's acknowledging the voices of our students and the labor, and valuing the labor of our students, and that it's really sort of aiming for transformative rather than just outputs, right? Like, we made a thing over the course of a semester. Here it is. Now we move on to the next thing. And then even spaces like, there was a quote that was going around Twitter couple weeks ago, where it was Katsuhiro Otomo who did the manga Akira, which is sort of a speculative fiction that's commenting on post-World War II Japan in a lot of different ways. And he talks a bit about how the visualization of this sort of nuclear blast that happens in this book required a lot of labor and attentiveness to detail, and the relationship between the actual bodies Otomo was trying to represent in this visualization was at the forefront of his mind as he was drawing these black inks. So I think that's another interesting thing to think about in the context of these sort of embodied lives. Jessica Marie Johnson's Markup Bodies, which came out in 2018, and Monica cites in an American Quarterly article that she's written about the project. I think this, as we're working on this project, we are trying to think of what that work means in relation to these sort of institutions that we're all variously a part of, and sort of the work of the humanities, these conversations that have sort of been ongoing in other capacities too. So last but not least, just so we've talked a bit about metadata and how metadata has its effectiveness and also has its limitations. One recent conversation we were having with the research team was thinking about what to do with the witnesses of violence and the sort of folks that are parts of communities and are sort of entwined and enmeshed with these scenes of violence, or complicit or sort of silent and other things, and how data does and does not sort of fit into that sort of work. So the metadata work is still iterative and ongoing. And we've done some preliminary internal-facing, research with visualizations using some tools that academic researchers make use of. So Emily Eston, who was a previous public human, graduated. What does this look like in Carto? What's limiting about how it looks in Carto? More recently, Nicole Synthetos and Andrea Malpica were making use of GIS tools to just get a sense of what how the data is telling stories in its current state and what it's not telling. So this work got us really thinking about the need for precision in sort of mapping things spatially, and where certain clusters, when you looked back at the data, were making arguments and thinking about space in ways that actually distorted the data points themselves. So it's sort of interesting exercises and just to advocate for these more inward-facing visualizations that you can then talk about and think about and process on projects like this is often very productive in lieu of just like spitting them out into the world and then not providing that context or that additional information. So like I said, we've written more about this. This was just kind of a quick sampling of some of the things that we've talked about, and I will get out of the way for our next speakers. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here for lots of reasons, one of which I'm a proud Brown alum, had to say that, class of 85, history. So I'm back here thinking about my younger self. So I'm going to start off saying a bit about the project and specifically the database. That's really what is driving us and is the basis of the mapping project, which is coming later and which is very much in process. But I thought it important to say a bit about what is making our data, the origins of our database and the sources of our materials, as well as the method. So as Monica mentioned, there was a conference back at Northeastern last year called the Digital Red Record. But actually, this project began in 2007. At Northeastern Law School, there was a conference about cold cases. It's cold cases of the Civil Rights Movement. And in the process of having that conference, of which David and Geoff were a part of it, we recognized that there wasn't a lot known about actually a lot of the violence of the Civil Rights Movement. There's much ink that has been spilled on civil rights, for sure. There has never been as much interest in its coercive dimensions. And then even going back further before the Civil Rights Movement, thinking about the Jim Crow period. And we realized that actually that wasn't well understood either, right? So Michelle Alexander's great book, The Old Jim Crow, we all thought, the new Jim Crow, we thought we'd better understand the old Jim Crow. In part because we weren't convinced that there was enough known about the nature of violence. So the scope of the project is looking at violence in the American South, the former Confederate states, from 1930 to 1970, with a particular emphasis on 1930 to 1954, using 1954 as an important marker because that is the beginnings of the arguably the modern civil rights movement with the Brown v. Board of Education decision. And arguably, one could think about the violence post-Brown as, in part, white mobilization against black civil rights, right? But the Jim Crow period itself, and its coercive dimensions, we thought had not been well understood. So we thought we should probably think about better understanding that and getting a database together. Now, as a social scientist, as a political scientist, lots of political scientists want to use data to figure out violence, and typically the only database that exists is one by two sociologists, Beck and Toney, came out, they wrote a book, Festival of Violence, in 1995, which talks about lynching, and it begins in 1888 after the Civil War, and it stops at 1930. But there's no discussion after 1930. There's an argument in the book, and several historians have picked up on the argument, which is basically there was a precipitous decline in violence after 1930. And they argue it had something to do with mechanization and of blacks moving out of the South, in part to escape the violence. But it was an assertion. It was an assertion because there was no data to back up the argument after 1930. And so hence we thought we would begin to start the database beginning with 1930. Professor Burnham, the brain person behind this, thought to use the pedagogical tools that are available at law schools, and particularly at Northeastern Law School, which has this great clinic model. And so the CRRJ clinic was set up. And so law students are a really important part of this project. So just to go back for a moment, the database that I mentioned that the sociologists developed, they largely used newspaper articles. And they did some evidence to make sure that the basics of the newspaper articles and of the deaths were right, that the deaths actually happened. But oftentimes, newspaper articles were wrong, and they were wrong for lots of different reasons, some of which Monica mentioned in her discussion, They're not always reliable for lots of different reasons. But they do provide a useful base. And that's where CCRJ starts. So we send students, we give them typically just a newspaper article. And the students have to run it down. They have to do the discovery, the work of being a lawyer. The first thing that they typically try to do is find a living descendant. If they find a living descendant, that living descendant in effect becomes the client of the student. And the student then begins to gather as much information from the family. And we also get as much information as we can from existing archives, including the NAACP, the Department of Justice, the FBI, sometimes the War Department, and other civil rights organizations at the time. In addition to the students doing their archival research, we have a researcher based in Washington, D.C., who also helps us get these materials from the National Archives. The students, in turn, run down as much as they can about these cases. We give them 4 or 5 newspaper articles. Some turn out to be duds. Some of them tend to be quite fruitful and end up taking us to places we wouldn't have imagined. And when they sometimes go down to southern places, because we do send them out into the field, and they end up in courthouses and such, because they are law students. So the issues that we are concerned about are largely about what are the violations of law. And for me, what are the dimensions of politics? But once they do that, when they're out in the field, they typically will find other cases, Because what we find in the newspaper articles or in the National Archives aren't well reflected in local archives, Lots of things that in local archives don't make them up to the National Archives. So in effect, you have kind of a snowball method where we are able to build on what we're finding. At the moment now, we have, and certain of these cases get worked up, meaning when I say worked up, the students find as much as they can about the documentary evidence. That, in the end, will become part of our archive, which will eventually be public-facing, open to scholars as well as to the general public. We have roughly about 500 cases that are fully worked up. We have over 1,000 cases that our archivist in murders, that is, killings, that our archivist has discovered, has researched from his work, but we have yet to kind of fully work those up. As was mentioned in Monica's in Jim's presentation, students are an important part of this. It is part of their learning, but it's also their labor that they put into it, and they're learning a lot of it, and we're gaining a lot of it out of it. In the end, our hope is that the archives will become the basis of lots of other work, including mapping, right? But we have no illusions that a map is going to help us understand the depth of the depravity of the Jim Crow period. What will do that is getting as much of this information as we can and documenting it as best we can, understanding that not everything is accurate. We get that, or there are not going to be ambiguities and tensions. That is the nature of archival research. But at least it would allow us to begin to have a conversation rooted in the facts as we understand them that can help us better understand violence in the Jim Crow period. And we hope that this will help to further the conversation today about how we think about different racial violence that's happening today, as well as how we understand, for example, the Black Lives Matter movement. So, one thing to say, certainly, arguably, has Black lives, really ever mattered, right? We don't want to be too simplistic in our presentations of it. The idea is to really complicate and to get a much deeper appreciation of the nature of racial violence in the American South during the Jim Crow period. So with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague, Margaret, and she'll talk a bit about one of the extensions of the archive.
Thanks so much, Melissa. And yes, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for including us in this really absolutely fabulous gathering. I want to thank Marissa Brown for all the emails and phone calls, and of course our colleague Monica for her inspiring work and for her colleagueship around these issues of racial violence and bringing them to a new public. As Melissa says, there are essentially three aspects to the work. There's the archive, and then there is the work that the pedagogy, and then there's the restorative justice angle of the work. And I see the archive as really part of a sort of meta archive. You can think of it kind of like the Russian dolls, that there's this, we're sort of inside other archives, and the meta archive is the archive of Black lamentation and protestation and visual images of the insistence of violence on the Black body that you see in, for example, Emmett Till in his coffin, or Michael Brown on the ground, or Billie Holiday's song, or other expressions and comments on violence against against Blackness. So if that's the meta archive, then inside that, as Monica mentioned, is the archive that's about counting and accounting that Ida B. Wells is so well associated with. And this is really, I'm borrowing here from my colleague Geoff Ward, who's taught us that our work is in that that we're part of that modality, that we're continuing to sort of try to make an account and try to understand what transpired and what it means to us today. And our models are, of course, the Grimskys and Ida B. Wells and others. And then again, as Dr. O'Brien said, this is also about the pedagogy. So for me, it's about, I teach in a law school, it's about sort of understanding what's fact and what's rumor, how you find facts, how you justify and account for the facts that you found, and how you understand, how you come to understand personally and get it into your blood, the fragility of our legal system. And you can only see that by seeing what goes wrong and by doing it yourself. And so it's the pedagogy. And then finally, it's bringing these cases back home. Because, as Monica said, it's about data, but it's about more than data. And so the students not only do the research, but then they take the cases back to the communities where the events transpired and work with those communities to develop practices and forms of justice. What would justice look like for you now in your community? And that can be a year-long project for a student. So as Melissa said, we have 500 cases. We've been doing this for quite a while. So we eventually the archive will be available, fully available to the public. Even when it's fully available, it will be in some sense unfinished because, again, people will add to the archive, they'll change the archive, and we'll never, as Monica also said, we'll never have a complete account or a complete count or account. So in that sense, it will be unfinished, but we hope to, in 3 years, we hope to make it available to the public. In the meantime, what we are doing is trying to use our materials to get them out there, get them out into the world in various formats. We have a project now called, what do I do here? Let's see, called the Historical Injustices and Present Policing Project, in which we are pulling cases from the archive to create training materials that professionals in criminal justice, police officers, probation officers, prosecutors can use to understand the nature of intergenerational trauma and historical harms. So that project includes a map, and it includes training materials that we've created, paper training materials that we've created, and as well an intergenerational trauma toolkit. So our time is short, and I'm going to now turn it over to my colleague, Katie Sanson, to say something about the map, because actually the only maps that I understand are the kind when me and my parents drove across the country, and my father would say to my mom, could you go in the glove compartment and pull out the map? And she would pull out the map, and it was, you guys don't remember this, but it was a folded thing, so you kind of unfold it. And then he would say, well, where's Connecticut on the goddamn map? Those are the maps I remember. So, Katie, where are you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Sanson. I'm a clinical fellow at CRRJ. And as Professor Burnham said, I will be helping showcase our map. As she mentioned, the map is part of the HIP project, and a screenshot of how it looks today is up on the screen. This map is still very much a prototype. We are continuing to clean it up, to add cases, and so it is not publicly available yet, but we wanted for this conference to give you all the opportunity to explore the map, to take a look at it. So at the link at the bottom of the screen, this map will be publicly available until the end of the day tomorrow. It's a bit.ly link, so it's just bit.ly/CRRJmap. So we hope you'll take the time to take a look at it throughout the day today. You can follow along now, as hopefully it will work for us right now. I had it up, but I'm not sure where I put it. Oh, there it is.
I think it's down here, yeah. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it. Great, thank you so much. So what we're going to do now is we're just going to dive into the map a little bit and explore some of the different features, how you can sort through the data, and what kind of information the map will take you to when it is live, the types of information on the case and materials from the archive that you'll be able to see in the map. So up here, the web page starts with some background on CRRJ. It has sort of a featured case study, and then if you scroll down here, you'll be able to get to the map. I don't know why it's doing the bar down there, but you'll still be able to see it on your browser. So I think just to dive in, one of the first ways that you can filter through the material is actually just by case name. Over here in the bottom corner, which is not showing up on the screen. And I don't know where it's going. Yeah, it's not showing the left side of the screen page, so I was trying to scroll.
And where is it now? Down here?
I don't know where it went.
Oh.
I didn't click anything. Oh, press there. Because there's another bar over here that's not showing.
Jim, do you know how to do this?
I can use the screenshots if that's easier. I have some backup.
Do you want to try? Or? We're beyond my capabilities.
Mine too.
Do you want to see if you can help?
There's usually,
Where that is?
yeah. Well, and also usually further to the left, there's one more of these filter categories.
Yeah, I'm not seeing.
That's okay. I can
Okay.
use the screenshots for this, and then I'll come back to the live part for the end. Here we go. So you'll see on the screen here, the first way that you can search through the information is just by scrolling through the names. If you go to that far right search bar, you'll be able to scroll through the name of the victim for every single case that we have available on this map right now. So if you already know the name of the person that you're looking for, or the case name that you're looking for, you can go there. So to use one example, the case that you saw featured above on the website, that's the case of Henry Peg Gilbert, a farmer who was killed while in jail in Harris County, Georgia. He'd been arrested for allegedly harboring another black man who was wanted for the shooting of a white man. And so if you go to that bottom bar, and I was going to show you how you can scroll through all the case names, but you search for Gilbert, and what will come up will be that highlighted circle there on the map, and then it will also scroll through on this timeline to the left, or to the right. His name will come right up, it'll be highlighted, and you'll be able to click there to see all of the information about his case. And I think the map should work for the rest of these, because they were showing up. So another way that you can filter here, there are 14 states represented in this map right now, some of which are more fleshed out than others and have more cases than others. But if you search by state, this can be a really great way if you're trying to see trends in particular geographical areas. You can search by state or by city. So if you're looking, for example, for cases where a particular local police department or law enforcement officer was involved in multiple cases, you can search by city. If you want to narrow down and search by state and see how many cases there were in different states in our current archive that we've identified and fully researched, you can do that. So if I click here, I search to Georgia, you'll see all of the Georgia cases come up highlighted, and this time bar on the right actually filters out, so you'll only be seeing the Georgia cases in that timeline, and also down here along the bottom in the time bar, all of the Georgia cases will be highlighted. So you'll be able to see sort of how the trend plays out over time and be able to go to the cases in that state. Another way that you can search through this data, and one that I think is sort of the most interesting, I'm a relative newcomer to CRRJ, and so as I've been learning the cases, this has been really helpful for me in sort of understanding some of the themes in our archive, is this search by phrase feature. And you can really use that to explore some trends across cases. So one example, in the Gilbert case that I mentioned before, he was a farmer, he was a landowner, and that's sort of a theme across some of our cases, is that you have prosperous black farmers, black landowners who have been targeted. And so if you were to go to this search bar and type in farmer, you'll see all the cases come up where, for example, farmers were involved. And you can do this with some of the other types of cases that that are frequent in our archive. So for example, a number of the victims in our archive were World War II veterans. If you search veteran in there, you'll see a number of different cases come up involving veterans. We try to showcase in our archive a number of women victims. So if you search woman there, you'll see different cases come up where the victim was female. And so that can be a really useful feature as well. And I encourage you to check that out to see, to see some of the themes across all of the data. And so the last thing I want to show you really quickly is what information you'll actually see if you're able to get to the correct case. And as I mentioned, it is a prototype, so we occasionally have glitches where you're not able to get to the correct case, as I'm having on this browser. I promise it was working right out there beforehand. So in that case, I will show you in the PowerPoint. But so when you do scroll through the time bar, you find the case you want to look at. I want to go to the Henry Peg Gilbert and Gus Davidson case in 1947. If I click on that, the first thing that will come up is the case summary. And that's where a lot of our student work to piece together these cases. They work to write us case summaries and case essays, and that's where you'll be able to see the background on the case, what we know about Henry Peg Gilbert, about his life, and about the circumstances that led to his death. On the right-hand side, you'll see a section called legal status. And again, we have law students working on this case. They focus very much on whether there was any kind of formal investigation, whether there were legal proceedings. And so in this case, you'll have background on the investigation following the killing itself. There was also Gilbert's wife ended up being arrested as well for harboring Davidson. So you'll see information on that case and information on the legal proceedings that happened actually after Davidson was found and arrested. So you'll be able to see those. And then in the top right corner, which is what I really wanted to show you online, is there's a See More Materials button. And so for cases where we have materials that are publicly available in the archive, you'll be able to click there and it will take you to those materials. So for the Gilbert case, if you click there, you'll be able to see the essay that the students wrote with all of the additional information about the story in much more detail. You'll be able to see some images from our archive of Gilbert at the time. And you'll be able to see, I believe, a case summary in slightly more detail as well. And so again, we're continuing to flesh out the archive and the map, and so there'll be different amounts of information and different amounts of materials publicly available. But I really encourage you, if you have access now and it's working better than mine appears to be working, to check out that feature and explore what is available right now. I forgot I was on the PowerPoint already because I wasn't supposed to be. But the last thing I just want to do is give a quick acknowledgement to our partners, New Law Maps, who partnered with us to create this map. They work with digital storytelling, particularly on topics related to the legal system and access to justice. And they have a lot more maps that can be really interesting to explore. They're available on their website, the New Law Lab at Northeastern. And they also asked me to acknowledge Stephen Braun, who is really the lead on creating this map in particular. He's a data visualization specialist. And so with that, I believe I'm turning it back to Marissa.
I don't know what time it is. I was going to say good morning, and I got confused. What I really want to say is thank you to all the organizers, Marissa, Monica in particular, who's been just a great colleague and and friend. We've been developing, as she mentioned, a collaboration over the past few years. I also want to give a special thanks to Margaret Burnham, who back in 2000, I think it was around 2006, I was a new assistant professor at Northeastern University, and Margaret got tired of hearing me talk about my book I was working on at the time on the racial history of juvenile justice. She said, "You need something else to talk about, so why don't you come down to Mississippi with me to Tougaloo College, where we're going to for a meeting about developing a Mississippi truth and reconciliation process. And you're always talking about this historical stuff. You might be interested." And at that meeting, I met my good friend and close collaborator, David Cunningham, who will do the second half of our talk. But at that meeting, David and I, who are both sociologists, decided that one way we could contribute to this effort in Mississippi was to kind of step aside from the group and begin to build a database of race-related political violence in Mississippi that would inform the reckoning that was envisioned through that project. And that's kind of where my role in this work began. So what I want to talk about today is how that work has evolved, specifically with respect to our interest in data visualization through mapping and other applications, and the particular problems, the particular interests recently David and I have been grappling with, which is how do we move away from this kind of incident-focused representation of this history and try to capture visually the more complex ecologies of repression that don't always in every place manifest as, say, the kind of things that register as violence. This is a map from I just found recently at an online museum called the Ozarks Afro-American Museum, where one of their digital records is this map that's dated from 1904. I think that they mean the map was printed in 1904, but it was annotated to identify 3 events of racial terror in close proximity to each other in terms of time and space. Events of basically pogroms where black populations were displaced from one town to the next, and this is in southwest Missouri. I just begin with this because it's as many people have said, we are sort of bearing the torch that others have carried, and we're not, of course, the first to realize that data visualization is an important part of this advocacy. My own interest in advocacy data visualization and mapping, including from a research perspective, but also from a more engaged perspective, really stems from what grew out of the work David and I began to do back in 2007. And that is, this growing body of work, some of which we've contributed to, showing empirically that county histories of racial violence, and this has most often been measured in terms of histories of enslavement and lynching, other race-related political violence, help to explain patterns of conflict and violence and inequality in the same places today. And this has been shown, this is just a partial list of the many outcomes today that we know from social science research are predicted significantly by histories of racial violence, net of other factors. Our most recent paper coming out in the next month or so in Social Problems shows that every additional lynching in the history of a county increases the odds that a black child will be corporally punished in public schools today. This is an analysis of 11 southern states where corporal punishment remains legal. In case you didn't know, corporal punishment remains legal in 19 U.S. states. Most routinely practiced, though, in a few states, Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. And we show clearly through this research that if you are a child, and particularly a black child, although the effect is observed for all children in those schools, the likelihood that you will be violently punished is directly related to the history of racialized violence as measured by lynching in that county. So this body of work to me suggested really 2 things. One is that as a sociologist, we need more data, better data, on this haunting history of racial violence. The lynching databases are incomplete. Not only do they not capture events since the decline of what was defined narrowly as lynching, but they also don't capture an enormous number of events that were not classified as lynchings in the so-called lynching era, such as assassinations of activists or displacement through threats. I'll show you an example of one of those in a moment. So this led to the development of what I've called the Racial Violence Archive, where I've been using this kind of method of aggregating county-level data on from our historical racial violence database to visualize both the proliferation of the sort of expansiveness of this history, as well as the way that it varies, at least as far as we know through the records we've processed so far, as well as the way that it varies in terms of concentration from one place to another. So we often, for example, talk about the Deep South as a kind of it's a sort of uniform phenomena, but you can look at all of these states and see that this particular history is really concentrated in some places more so than others. And the empirical research I began with suggests that that's meaningful in terms of human well-being, life prospects, and so forth today. This is a leaflet version of the map. I have no really technology skills. I mentioned I'm a sociologist. I'm trying to develop these skills kind of late in the game, but I'm working with a number of students. I want to acknowledge undergraduate and graduate students who've kind of done the technology work to support the development of this part of the project. This is a leaflet version of the map that I have opted to push this very basic map out to the public without all of the refinement and comprehensiveness that I intend to develop in it. And I began using with Google Fusion, and the keynote speaker this morning raised the point about this sort of dependence upon these technology firms. So I used Google Fusion tables initially, and Google, now they're telling, every time I open the table, it says this will go away December 3rd. So I scrambled to get work with a student to build this leaflet version of the map. And if you hover over a county, it's an interactive map. It will show you simply the number of events that have been counted in the place thus far. The database behind the scenes that is not publicly available includes some of the metadata that Monica was mentioning, details about the aggressors, details about the aggrieved, about outcomes and so forth, narratives about what happened. The way the database has been populated has been through a few ways. One is by basically scraping events from existing accounts, a number of archives essentially of relevant data. IDB Wells, documentation of lynchings, and which became the basis of the sociologists Tolnay and Beck, actually the Tuskegee records, which drew on IDB Wells' work, became the basis of Tolnay and Beck's widely circulated database on lynching, which is, we know now, really incomplete, and thanks to the work of people like Monica and Clive and Webb and others, the attention to anti-Mexican violence, including lynching, is being added. This was not present in that work. The work of Michael Pfeiffer and others like Brent Campney, who I'm going to mention a bit more, who've been doing work on the Midwest, have begun to really expand that archive in ways that are essentially making their way into our aggregated collection of data. In a sense, the Racial Violence Archive is a collection of collections. In addition to scraping records from these kinds of sources, we manually entered all of the records from Civil Rights Congresses. We charged genocide petition 1951, and numerous other sources. In addition to that, we've done our own archival research in several states to go to the primary sources. We've begun to explore through collaborations with Digital Humanities, using machine learning to scrape, to identify cases from digitized newspapers. We've done that for Missouri, begun doing that for Missouri. A number of challenges I just want to acknowledge about this work, and I mentioned a little bit of that already, but the sort of definitional and measurement issues are really important challenges that we grapple with in thinking about this data visualization challenge and in all of its implications. The kind of fateful decision, necessary politically at the time, I think, but impactful decision of the Tuskegee and the NAACP to agree on a very narrow definition of lynching has compromised our historical record of race-related political violence. So events like this one, when Klansmen showed up at this man's house to deliver a Christmas package, being given a list of needy residents by the Augusta, Georgia Welfare Department. This kind of event of racial terror, what Rob Nixon sort of writes about as slow violence, unspectacular violence, is not in our archive. Nevertheless, it is relevant. This is a full-page story from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch in 1903, detailing a case in West Plains, Missouri, which I'll show you where that is in a moment, where the entire black population was driven out of the community. This happened in many places in Missouri and around the country to African American and other people of color. But the way this was affected was by leaving threatening notes in their mailbox, saying that if you did not flee, if you did not leave this town, you would be killed. So this is the kind of case that is not in our archives because of the way that the historical record has been built. This is a map this is the Google Fusion version of the map showing areas of Missouri where we have most extensively documented histories of racial violence through the methods that I mentioned. We've not yet really done archival research in Missouri. We expect this map to look very different over time, and really all of the map, the whole map that we're working on, to look different. But we do expect that this violence to be concentrated. It will be concentrated in the region called Little Dixie, established by white migrants from border South states who were determined to reproduce Dixie in Missouri. This is along the Missouri River Valley. The area of the Ozarks and of the Boot Heel. The Ozarks is the area where I showed you that opening map. Here's West Plains, where this whole region of central southern Missouri is empty in the map now, which is a problem. One of the, I'm sensitive to in terms of releasing this data publicly. But it is, so I go to great lengths. If you go to the Racial Violence Archive, you'll find a overly lengthy apology for the incomplete data and an invitation to join us in making it more complete. But I think that in the meantime, the maps are useful. And I'm going to just end with one example of how we're using this map, and this is also related to Shannon's earlier point about, what's important is not the map, but how it is activated. And so I was invited recently to go as a scholar in residence on a bus tour. Margaret, your comments about the map in the glove box are relevant here. To go on a bus tour from St. Louis to Montgomery to visit the Equal Justice Initiative Memorial, and just sort of facilitate dialogues about histories of racial violence and legacies. The bus tour is organized by the Jewish Community Resource Council in St. Louis and the Archdiocese of St. Louis, and their aim is to engage their constituencies in mobilizing around justice system reform in Missouri and using the site of conscience, the EJI, as a sort of activating tool. And so one of the things I'm working on now with my students at WashU is building a triptych. Those of you who are old enough to remember, when you go to AAA, you go on a road trip, you get that triptych, you can turn the pages. So we're going to build a triptych using historical racial violence data, the main aim of which is to essentially activate the entire route as a commemorative landscape, and to turn the bus itself into a site of conscience, so that people aren't sort of on the bus thinking, well, nothing happened here. When are we going to get there? Wake me up when we get to the place that's important. And so this is the route roughly we're going to take, although we're also going to go through Memphis, I've just learned. And what I'll do, in addition to overlaying the roadmap with the Choropleth map, is add to it, because the point is to mobilize people against mass incarceration and other injustices, is I will add to it features like courthouses where there are Confederate memorials and monuments along our route. And I will add to it the locations of federal, state, and private prisons. And we'll add to it things like Freedom Rider bus stops and The student I was working with, who's from Helena, Arkansas, one of the many sites of atrocity in this country, suggested we add locations of church burnings, which is a great idea, given the spiritual communities that are a part of this journey. So that'll be on the map. So I'm really excited about this application, and I wish I had more technology tools to do it more effectively. But I'm going to turn it over now to David, who's going to talk about the second half of our project, which is our presentation, which is this question of ecologies.
All right, thank you, Geoff. And I just want to start and add my voice to the beautiful chorus of folks and thank Monica for her vision and colleagueship over this long arc culminating today, and for Marissa so expertly bringing us all together today, and for Geoff and Melissa and Margaret, of course, for welcoming me to Northeastern and Tougaloo and back in 2007, as Geoff was mentioning, and for all that I've learned from them since. And one of the things I want to do is build on what Geoff's talking about here and think about ecologically about what it means to think about cultures and histories of violence. And as we do this, the step that we're really hoping to take is to move from systems that are focused on events to thinking about the systems of power that undergird those. And this is something in addition to event-centered approaches here. And I'll try to explain both what we're trying to do and then why we're trying to do it and what it might illuminate and of course, like everything, what it could obscure as well. And so illustratively, for the reasons that Geoff's talking about, we're going to focus largely on the state of Mississippi here and try to break down this idea that any space that we're working in is somehow unitary along these or other kinds of lines. And so when we're thinking about, well, how can we consider the landscape in Mississippi and the landscape of violence in Mississippi, one thing that we can do is move from events to think about the aggressors that lie behind these, the people who perpetrated this violence. And so we can take maybe the most unambiguous of those aggressors and take a group like the KKK in Mississippi throughout the Civil Rights era. This is part of our incomplete and corrupt archive here, which will speak to a bombing campaign in a particular place in Mississippi, in Macomb, in Pike County, in the fall of 1964. These are all separate events compiled by a congressional subcommittee. We can think more expansively about the range of things that the Klan was doing. And I'm just briefly moving over to North Carolina here. And this is from a whole range of archival accounts and sources where you can see in a 2-month period in the state of North Carolina the variety of things that the Klan was engaged in here. We can think in different ways about these groups too, because when we're thinking about organizations, we can think about the presence that they would have had in a durable way and often highly visible way in particular communities here. And we can map out, literally, these are groups that are chapter-based here, see themselves as chapter-based, and they have an organizational presence in all of these places. We can also try to disaggregate that organizational presence, because when we often can reify the Klan and talk about it as the Klan, and we're oftentimes dealing with multiple organizations that see themselves as distinct, sometimes in competition, sometimes in cooperation. In Mississippi at this point, as a lot of you know, we have two predominant groups, the White Knights of the KKK and United Klans of America. I'm just very simply kind of disaggregating this with the red W and the blue U. So when we return to this map, that's the distinction that we see. We can try to understand this organizational presence too in terms of leadership and organizational capacity. How were people recruited to these groups? And one thing that we can see, the green here is just taking a third of the Klan activity in Mississippi at the time and centering it right at, I'll just temporarily walk right over here in Jones County is where the leader of the White Knights, a lot of you know, a guy named Sam Bowers, was located in that particular county. And one thing that we can see is recruitment patterns radiating out from that particular place. So if we look at 2/3 of the Klan activity in the state, they're really a set of contiguous communities, these kinds of rings that we can look at. And we can get a sense of the logic of how people were connected across these particular areas. We can also zoom into particular places and say, well, organizational presence meant that these are people who are formally affiliated with this group, often in quite open ways. And so this data can be hard to come by, but in Natchez, Mississippi, we have individual data for Klan members. These are dues-paying Klan members, and we know where they lived. And so we can plot all this. And one of the very striking things about this is how they permeate the entire community. It would be difficult to live in any community, any neighborhood in Natchez, in either the white or the black community, and not have Klan members basically, contiguous to you. We can look at these little circles of how distant you would be from one of these members. And so we can kind of think in all these ways about particular organizations, agencies, perpetrators, aggressors. But perhaps the most important move that we're trying to make here is to say that it really is difficult, maybe impossible, to understand certainly a system of power, a system of repression in any of these places without aligning any particular group that we're looking at here alongside all of the actors that are going to be implicitly and almost always explicitly connected to these landscapes of violence. And so if we take a group like the KKK, it's really impossible to understand them and their significance without also looking at what the police are doing, what courts are doing, what school boards are doing, what voter registrars are doing, what civic organizations like the citizens' councils are doing to participate in these systems of violence. And so what we really want to try to demonstrate is not only that all of these actors were present and active as aggressors or perpetrators, but also to show how that varies in different places and think about the configurations of power that exist locally. So in some communities, the Klan may have been the predominant perpetrator in a lot of ways. In other places, the Klan played a relatively smaller role, and we see groups like the Citizens Councils kind of dominating the manner in which violence is perceived, felt, and experienced, and also impacting the community. And so what we've done, I won't get into any of the technical pieces of this, but one thing that we've done, Geoff and I, in conjunction with our collaborator, Peter Owens, is we've just used a process that's referred to in sociology as qualitative comparative analysis. And what that does here is that it tries to capture, if you look at all of, or at least a set of factors that you think could be important predictors of how power operates locally, what it looks at is it takes the literally hundreds of potential configurations of those factors, and it tries to identify which are predominant in particular places. And so what we see here is we can look at a group like the KKK and say, well, the KKK is predominant in two configurations that we're identifying here. But what we're able to do is kind of look at all of the possibilities, these kinds of fields of power, and say and identify 4 predominant configurations. And I know when I say it in the way I have, and when we look at it here, it's highly abstracted. So just to quickly walk through in a rudimentary mapping way, we can associate particular counties with each of these configurations. And so if I just isolate each one for just a minute, one pathway here, the counties that are highlighted here, are really characterized predominantly by their isolation. And the key actor in these places that are highly isolated tended to be law enforcement, because they could act with, in effect, this is true to a degree everywhere, but especially in highly isolated counties, with impunity, as they're perpetrating violence often in public in these places. These are places where the national media is never going. These are places that are not highly connected by train stops or all these other things that would create potentially a broader basis of accountability. We have a second kind of county that's predominantly associated with the Mississippi Delta region that's just characterized by a high level of economic vulnerability. And so the key actor here are groups like citizens' councils, comprised of business elites and other community leaders in the white community who tend to own a lot of land and control a lot of jobs, and they can exert pressures in these kinds of environments that really sort of dominate the system of violence. Other places look more like what we were discussing before, where you see organized vigilantist violence perpetrated by groups like the KKK. Here are areas where the KKK is predominating the absence of other modes of control. There are even more publicly violent places that are characterized by the high presence of KKK, but also in the presence of what we're thinking of as civil violence. This is often publicly perpetrated violence by individuals who are not seeing themselves as affiliated with formal vigilantist entities. And one of the things that you can see, and I'll try to end here because I know our time is short, is not only that we can differentiate these differing configurations and start to piece together the differing systems of power that were operating locally, but you may have seen or noticed in the preceding slides, what we were trying to do is track that on to the racial violence archive that Geoff was discussing, thinking about events. And here are just the median levels of events by configuration. One of the important things is that when we think about conventional metrics of violence, we are capturing significant differences across these configurations, right? The median level of documented incidents of violence in the isolated counties is actually 0. And we move up to 5 when we think of the second configuration, 12, 13. The numbers don't themselves matter. The distance between them does. And the main point I want to underscore when I say that 0 documented incidents of violence, of course, that is not at all to say that there is no violence occurring in these counties, and quite the contrary. The important point here is that by isolating, hopefully, these systems of power, what we're able to start to do at least, and we do not presuppose we're anywhere near this, but what we start to do is see what it is that our conventional sources are telling us and recognizing and documenting in terms of violence and what it looked like. And so I think, the better baseline for thinking about this is that we have a relatively even level of violence. These are places where the coercive aspects of Jim Crow, as Melissa was saying, are going to be omnipresent across this entire environment. And so just a matter of the means through which that violence is expressed. And a lot of archival sources that we tend to draw on are uneven in their ability to pick up those particular sources in ways that we tend as social scientists to count and consider in that way. So what we're hoping to do by isolating these configurations of power is to be able to see what it is that we're recognizing and what it is that we're not recognizing as we think about racial violences and the legacies that they may have through all the kinds of signals we've been talking about today as well. So thank you.
Slideshow or presenter view?
Yat Shea Mariah so Yanishia, Bilagana Nishle, not Kate and Netwatlini Bashashin, Bilagana Dashache, do look outside Dashanella. In the Denoe, it's customary to introduce yourself by your clans as a way of establishing your identity through your relationships and kinship. So I'm from an island that's green across the wide water to the east by my mother's lineage. I'm born for the wandering people from the place where the water flows together. By my maternal grandfather, I'm also from that same green island. And from my paternal grandfather, I am from an eagle's nest made of reeds on a high mesa. Now, ordinarily, I don't translate my introduction into English just as a way of resisting centering the English language, but given the content of this event, I wanted to provide kind of an example of an ancient auditory map that exists outside of the Eurocentric spatial ontologies. But I'm here to talk about the Million Dollar Hoods project. As mentioned, I'm part of a much larger team. Simply put, we map the human and fiscal cost of mass incarceration. So starting with location, we're based in LA, and we stay in LA for a couple different reasons. Los Angeles operates the largest jail system in the country, and the US imprisons more people on earth than any other country. The other elements of Los Angeles that are important is that we have very large communities of those most impacted. So we have the largest Mexican population north of the US-Mexico border. We have the largest Black population west of Mississippi, the largest urban Native population in the country, and one of the largest homeless, houseless populations in the country as well. So it's when you start looking at all of those narratives together that you can see how the Los Angeles perspective is really important in understanding the crisis of mass incarceration. So one of the origins for the framework of our process is Kelly Lytle Hernandez's work in City of Inmates. And City of Inmates tracks the rise of incarceration in LA from the Spanish colonial period to the Watts Rebellion in 1965. And when she first began her research, she knew that race and labor were certainly important, especially in building off of work like Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow. But what about other central themes specific to the U.S. West? So what about indigeneity and immigration, borders and borderlands? And ultimately, she came to the unifying theme of talking about settler colonialism. And for those not familiar, settler colonialism differs from other forms of colonialism by the main objective being obtaining land rather than resource extraction or labor exploitation. So when you put those together, you get this equation of mass incarceration is the equivalent of mass elimination. So that's the elimination of Native peoples and Native bodies from the land, and also the disappearing of racialized outsiders and sexual outsiders from the white settler society. So in looking at her research and trying to find the historical aspect of things, one of the challenges was the LAPD and the LA Sheriff's Department had eliminated and erased most of the historical archives. So she turned to the stories and the lives of the people who were actively resisting that erasure of those stories. And that's something that we refer to as the Rebel Archive. Today, the Rebel Archive can be seen as those on the front lines and the community organizations who are working against and actively against narratives of criminalization for our communities. And so when you start looking at all of these different regimes of power working together, what are ways that you can actively resist them? We started looking into ways that we could actually get the data, because when we went as community orgs to ask for the data, the departments did not give those out. So working in conjunction with community and using the California Public Records Act, we were finally able to win the data through a lawsuit, and ultimately ended up with 27 different variables and aspects of everyone who were arrested in the two agencies. And that includes things such as time of day, date of release, the different charge codes, race, eye color, et cetera. And the total count was in the millions in terms of records. So we have this very large data set, and the question came to be, what do we do with it? So we looked at two sources of inspiration, one being the Eddie Ellis and Greenhaven study group, which main finding was the majority of Black men moving through Greenhaven came from 7 zip codes. So that introduces the idea of the geography of incarceration and looking for those spatial patterns. And then $1 million blocks is something that Columbia scholars and people at other universities started looking at adding in the economic aspect of incarceration. So they were looking at mapping how much is being spent to lock up people per neighborhood and per block. And so we took that same kind of framework, and since LA with the horizontal sprawl rather than like the vertical stacking of cities like Chicago and New York, we focused on neighborhoods. And so that's how we came to be $1 million hoods. And the million comes from, we found that, and the same with $1 million blocks, that in some instances, areas were spending in the millions of dollars on these incarceration practices. So here's a highlight for our team. We are a university-based and community-driven team. We are predominantly Black, Brown, and Indigenous-led. And we also have, this is just a small sampling of the community partnerships that we have. So we had the numbers, we started crunching, and we got one very, very large number. So between the years of 2012 and 2016, there were over $19 billion spent in bail levied in the city, not the county of Los Angeles. And what that means is that we have this cost account now, but what about the drivers? So the LAPD and the LA Times will say that violent crimes such as rape and murder are driving mass incarceration, but if you look at the data, there's a different story. The top 2 charges are drug possession and DUI. And so we have a system that is treating substance abuse and addiction through policing and incarceration, and we're paying tens of millions of dollars to do it. So imagine what that amount of money would do in places like substance abuse services, counseling, education, housing services, and institutions that build healthy and thriving individuals, families, and communities. So we started with one map. If you go to milliondollarhoods.org, you can interact with the map here. And we were able to really pinpoint which neighborhoods were spending the amount, or where money was being extracted from these different communities, which were predominantly in areas that are disproportionately Black and brown. And then from this one map, we then moved into creating a series of reports. These are rapid response reports. They're usually between 1 and 2 pages. I'll just share with you 2 here today. One of the ones that we did was looking specifically at police data with the LA school system, and we found 2 major findings. 1 and 4 were elementary and middle school age, so those are children who are 14 and under. And then the second was that this disproportionately affected Black children in particular. So of the total youth arrests, that was 25%, which is despite being only 9% of the overall population. Another report that I'll share with you is looking at women in particular, and this became particularly important in providing the data in the fight against opening a new jail within the Los Angeles County, and had a huge impact in informing the County Board of Supervisors' decision to trying to expand this system. So another component that we have is an oral histories project that was led by one of our graduate students, Terry Allen. And so this is incredibly important because it kind of provides a window into how does excessive policing impact our most intimate relationships. We have over 100 testimonies that have been collected through this process. And then another element that we have is, so the narrative was that there were several historical records that were destroyed, but when you sue people, things pop up. So as part of that suit, we now have over 200 boxes of archival records that start in 1965 to the present. So in these boxes, we have the war on drugs, we have the war on youth. So we're now in the process of digitizing these records. And as a mapper, I'm super excited to see what kind of locational data might be in this, to see how we might use that as a platform to share this information publicly. And so we have all of these different elements. We have the history, we have testimonies, we have maps in GIS, we have descriptive statistics, how and why are we moving towards using all of these different tools. And what it ultimately comes down to is an equation for reparations. So we're able to quantify the amount of money that has been extracted from communities. So for instance, we know that $20 million in non-refundable bail bonds have been extracted from people's in particular neighborhoods. We know exactly which neighborhoods that this is occurring the most. And we also know from other research that it's women who most often pay bail. So in looking at the cascading effects of this, we can look at reparations as being able to quantify the fines, fees, and money that have been stripped from families. We can look at the homes lost and the wages unmade. We can look at the years stolen from our interactions with our family members and for the loved ones that have been taken by police violence, as well as the parents taken by deportation and the children lost to foster care. So this is kind of the overall impact of the kind of work that we do that started with one map, but you can see how just starting with that one particular tool, the kinds of cascading effect that you can get by starting to map back. So here's just a concluding slide. So yeah, thank you for allowing me to be here today.
So we are going to have our panelists join us up at the front to grab a seat. But while we're playing musical chairs and making space for everybody and they're coming up, why don't we go ahead and see if there's any questions, and we'll take 2 or 3 questions at the same time, and then we'll have our panelists respond to those. Yeah, come on and grab a seat. Are there any questions? Any questions? Okay, yep, we have one over here. I'm not sure if there's a microphone. Hannah, you're in charge of a mic over there. This is yours. Okay. Do we have a mic for the questions? I can be on there. I'll just stand.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question here and then in the back.
Good to go?
Yep, go ahead.
Okay, really amazing work being done across all groups. I wanted to ask about, the specific visual methods that are surfacing in the maps that you shared. One recurring challenge I've found in humanistic mapping endeavors is getting around the tyranny of the point, the line, and the polygon, which particularly with vector graphics are very clear-cut. And I think that accommodating ambiguity in databases and in the data gathering process is super important, and it sounds like all of you are addressing that. In the visual forms that manifest that data, how can you likewise account for ambiguity or account for gaps or erasures there? I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on that or yeah.
Great question. Okay, we'll take the question also in the back, and then we'll respond to both. Yep, in the back. Were there any other questions? Hands up? No? Okay.
Hi, I want to talk about an aspect of collecting histories and mapping. I worked in rural Texas for 4 years on a project that was with UT Austin, Baylor, and a small town called Mart, Texas. And an aspect that I found that's really important is the relationship building in terms of doing not just mapping, but collecting stories, and how some folks would talk off camera about things that were really painful but did not want to be recorded in any way. And also in a multiple role as a family member, project founder, teacher, researcher, artist, that there were things that we wanted to do in marking in the Brazos River where there was lynching and people were telling us stories. As the holder of all these multiple roles and unifying a project, I found that there were things we wanted to do that we were hesitant to do sort of guerrilla art and alternative mapping, because I was holding a responsibility in so many ways. And so I'm just interested in some of those conflicts and consequences of doing this work and trying to honor folks and yet balance a number of different things.
Great. Okay, who wants to take the first shot at answering either one of the first 2 questions? You want to speak to the second one? That's great.
So yeah, I could speak to the second one, which is the challenge of working with communities and with individuals who are carrying these stories of violence. So in our experience, there has to be a full exchange. We have to be able to give something to people and that they couldn't get on their own. And that's our point of entry with all of our communities, is that, you know, we're researchers. In our cases, we're looking at people who have lost their relatives and who don't know the details of what transpired. And so our students don't contact family members until they have something to offer. And what they have to offer is what academics offer, research. This is when it happened. This is how it happened. These are all the documents that we've been able to collect from the DLJ or from the local police about how it happened. And once that is the point of entry into a relationship, then the researcher forms a community with that individual to further expand what is known in the family about it. So there's a sharing thing that goes on. And so if we don't have that, if you can't just go and say, tell me your story. People value their stories, and they value them for their own sake, but they also don't want to share because they have some perspective on, what that value is. So that's kind of how we do it. Is we have to bring something to the table in order to develop these relationships. And if we don't have anything to give, then we don't get anything back.
I think my response is sort of to both questions. I'm not sure. I missed the first part of the first question, but I guess our project has been really focused on the historical record and what we can unearth from it, and we haven't engaged communities beyond the sort of involvement of our students and the presentation of the work. For example, Margaret's amazing the project they're doing at Northeastern and contacting descendants and working with them. We might at some point get to that in our project. But when I think about the community engagement piece of our project, I am mostly focused on the community that wishes to remain silent around this history and kind of forcing a conversation. I began with the social science research showing that we remain haunted by these histories. Very clearly, empirically, we need to deal with these legacies. And so my thinking about the use of the data visualization with all of its imperfections and problematics is that it opens a dialogue that is desperately needed. And I'll just give you a last example of that is my own family. Many African American families don't talk about these histories. Other families don't talk about these histories related to them. My mother, just a few years ago, said, she just asked me what was going on. I said I was giving a talk at a university about my research on racial violence, and I think she usually turns off like when I start saying. After I say talk, she's like, but she said, that happened to us. And I had been working on this for almost a decade by this point, and she said, I said, tell me more. And she said, I knew none of this. She said, our family is from Wilmington, North Carolina. And I was telling her, I was giving a talk about the 1898 racial massacre and coup in Wilmington. And she said, we were there. Your great-great-grandfather was there, and our family was affected by that event. So it's an example of how the sort of silences, I think. I mean, that's the aim here. But I'm deeply appreciative and of the sensitive work people like Monica and Margaret and others are doing to sort of deal with the ethics of this work. And that's part of the collaboration that I'm most excited about, honestly, more so than the kind of technological piece of it, the humanistic part of it that we have to grapple with collectively.
A lot of what Margaret mentioned with CRJ deals a lot with victims, but on occasion we've been able to have some relationships with perpetrators' descendants. And that's also quite complicated because at the end of the day, black people weren't killing themselves. They were being killed, and there were descendants and family members some of whom have a hard time. Oftentimes we don't ever really are able to figure out who the perpetrators were, and if we know the perpetrators, we certainly don't know the descendants aren't coming forward. So that is another part of this history that still needs to be done. I mean, if there's going to be a true reckoning with violence in the U.S., it also has to deal with the persons who are responsible for reckoning, for perpetrating it, and in a way which allows them some a space to deal with that. Because otherwise, it sounds as if it's the victim's problem or it's our issue when it's a national issue for all communities. So it seems to me there are two parts of this coin, and a lot of traction on this side, which is important, obviously. But there is another part of this. In order for there to be, it seems to me, the kind of comprehensive reckoning which I think we all would want at some point.
I'll say one quick thing about the visual, which is that, I'm so uncreative. So some of the advice that I've been given, one of the best pieces of advice came from Laura Wexler, professor at Yale, who said, you need to invest in a designer. And anything that you do, that you've got to be working with people who have creative digital skills, but who are going to think about the aesthetics. And that's, one of the early prototype screen grabs that I showed, for all the work that we're doing to think about loss and memorialization, it looks quite sterile. And so the sort of design aesthetics of the project as it exists, isn't succeeding in that effort. And another colleague, Annette Rodriguez, who's at UNC, who's a graduate of the PhD program here at Brown, she had the idea, she said, what if you didn't have, dots, but you had prayer cards? She said, what if you collaborated with artists and you thought about different ways of representing the loss of life? And so I think that collaborating with artists, collaborating with designers is going to be an important part of our project, to think about how you change the aesthetics of it and to move away from the dots and the lines, to think about digital storytelling in an interactive way that can incorporate different forms of multimedia. That's where we're moving. Yeah. We've got maybe time for, yes. Another comment here, and then we've got one more question.
I just had a quick response, just to trying to escape the tyranny of the point line and polygon. And I think when you're in the digital realm, that can be really difficult to do, because unless you have that really high level coding skill set to try to give just a new tool set to work with, can be really difficult. But I think one avenue to escape that is to not just use a digital map and to use something else in addition to that, and try to think creatively about the ways you can use physical manifestations of maps. And what I mean by that is we can look at the example of Cisna or honeybee. I mean, they're one of the, they have their own spatial knowledge systems. I think scientists call it a waggle dance, where they communicate the location and distances of their food through dancing. So by that example, you can try to think creatively of well, how would you dance a map into being? Or try to think of ways where you're using different senses and maybe not just your eyes or kind of a digital platform. So,
yeah. So right here in front. Or did you have a question? Yeah, I think last question goes to the keynote speaker.
I just want to thank all of you. That was a really fantastic panel. Every presentation was really really inspiring and beautiful. Speak up. Okay, sorry, stand up. Oh, okay, all right. Okay, so my question is about the spatial and digital humanities have gone through, I think, several phases where, first of all, it was let 1,000 flowers bloom. Everybody's building their own mapping platform, then saying, why don't we actually join our efforts? So I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to the value of having separate maps, each with a different kind of mission, a different geographic focus, that are all kind of have a similar thematic orientation. So what could you potentially learn by each other? Where can your different projects kind of merge and have greater power, something greater than the sum of the parts? And why is there also value in having 4 separate projects that are kind of have their each individual orientation to mapping violence?
Great question. Okay.
So I will say that we've, as everyone has said here, we've all been in communication. We've all been, we're friends, not just friendly, but we're actually friends over a period of 10 years. We work in different institutions. There are institutional reasons why this is not just one project. Each of us has a different library. Each library has different archivists and different people who create the maps. And so there are structural institutional reasons for the disparate nature of the projects. Some of it comes from our disciplines. Melissa's political science, I'm from law, so we're working off of the idea that we need to map from 1930 forward. These guys are sociologists, so they have different disciplinary perspective. And of course, Monica's work is down on the border in Texas. But we are in conversation about how, at the end of the day, these maps can all talk to each other and be publicly available, perhaps through one point of access. So, we're talking about, what common metadata should we be developing? What common vocabulary? To what extent can there be ways of making the data, when it is fully accessible, work together?
And I should
Geoff,
say that we've invited this panel to stay till tomorrow, and they're going to talk to each other and continue this discussion. So we wanted to build that in to the conference so that those conversations can continue.
Yeah, just on the point of having multiple projects. So like one of the projects that I showed was it was Google supported project, and I think like it can be, like saying, well, Google covered this, or there's a grant already for this particular project. As we've seen, there's such a range of different approaches that folks can take to data, to the particular stories, to the relationship between the local and the global and the national. So I think, the sort of methodology of like working in different institutions, resource sharing, finding opportunities to work together is preferable to the outsourcing to these various other companies, or just assuming that a sort of top tier is going to come in and take care of us and save us. So.
This is something that's been really important to me for a while. I think it's important. It's interesting to historically contextualize that question, even given that the data we're sharing is itself. I mean, I love the idea of the Rebel Archive. The Rebel Archive, just to use that concept, is a long-standing repository that is the product of intentional and accidental collaborations and so forth. And to some extent, I think, to answer the point about what's valuable about the discrete projects, to some extent, I think the discrete projects cultivate usefully different kinds of knowledge about, for example, areas. I mean, the United States, this is really a global phenomenon we're talking about, and you can imagine ultimately a global mapping violence project that would require local collaborators to contribute to the collective endeavor. But even in the U.S. context, just taking on Texas is a massive undertaking, or California, where I'm from, is a massive undertaking. The Deep South has been, for good and not, so much of the focus of the documentary effort historically, that we have much better data on that area. But we, practically speaking, I think we need people in the Northwest, for example, and in the Southwest and in the Northeast to engage locally in efforts that might be discrete in some ways, but also contributing to a collective body of knowledge that shares similar metadata, Margaret mentioned, that shares similar kind of processes, both sort of in a logistic sense, but also in a kind of ethical sense that's committed to a common set of values. And I'm hoping that we'll build towards that. I think the last thing I wanted to say about this is, like much of what we know about this history is the product of the crowdsourcing that was involved in the production of the black press, for example. And but there's also a cautionary tale about going separate ways that the NAACP and Tuskegee offer us. They ended up essentially competing in their annual reports of lynching, and their discrepancies between those reports contributed to a kind of weakening of the anti-lynching movement because it was seized upon by the white press and government actors to say, why should we believe anything these people are saying? They don't have the same story. They're making up the data, et cetera. So there's reason to do, I think, the discrete projects. Margaret spoke to that, others. But there's also, I think, important for us to figure out where we can converge and to do that as soon, I hope.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. We have so much work to do. Part of that work, I think, is hopefully you can help us promote the work that's been presented today, bring attention to the ongoing efforts to recover these histories, but also the ongoing efforts to fight for social justice today. And so please, I think the other thing to take away from this is that, one museum in the South or the Equal Justice Initiative as one project, many people have looked at that as a success for promoting these histories and bringing awareness, but we have so much more work to do in this recovery. So thank you so much for your attendance, and your engagement, and please help me thank our guests for joining us today.